The conference module had been assembled in 4 hours by a crew of 6, which Commander Yael Soren considered either an achievement or a warning, depending on how you thought about the kind of diplomacy that required portable architecture. It sat now on the surface of Ratha's second continent, a prefabricated oval of composite paneling and pressure-sealed viewports, its climate systems maintaining an interior temperature that the Vrathi had described as tolerable for human biology, which was not the same thing as comfortable. Soren had read the preliminary contact reports 3 times on the transit in. She had a habit, developed over 22 years of working in proximity to people who needed things from her, of reading documents until she understood not just what they said, but what the people who wrote them had decided not to say. The report said the Vrathi were cooperative. They said the Vrathi were intellectually sophisticated, technologically mature, and receptive to the idea of contact. They said their communication methods were tactile and object-based in ways that human linguists were still modeling. What the reports did not say, and what Soren suspected the report writers had not known how to say, was whether the Vrathi were warm, whether they were the kind of civilization you could sit across a table from and find, beneath the difference, something you recognized. She had asked this question of Admiral Haverstock before departure, not diplomatically, but directly, the way she had learned to ask things after enough years of being in rooms where directness was the only language that mattered. Can we trust them? Haverstock had looked at her for a moment before answering. He was a man who understood the weight of words, which was why she had asked him and not the diplomatic briefing team. "We don't know enough yet to trust them," he said. "That's why we're sending you." Soren had not been a diplomat first. She had been a combat medic attached to the 14th Forward Surgical Unit during the Kepler conflict, which was a name the historians had given to 18 months of engagement that the people who had survived it did not call by any name at all. She had worked in field conditions, in mobile units, in the back of shuttles with failing environmental systems and equipment that was rated for planetary use and had been repurposed for orbital deployment because it was what they had. She had been decorated twice. She kept the decorations in the same drawer, where she kept the things she did not need to look at to remember. After Kepler, she had spent 3 years in reconstruction medicine on Callisto Station, followed by 2 years of something that the fleet's counseling service had called reintegration, and that Sword had called learning to sleep again. It was during the 2nd year of this process that a lieutenant commander in the diplomatic corps had reviewed her file and noted something that had not been in the medic section. The 18 months at Kepler had included, in their second half, 3 separate instances of negotiating with opposing commanders for medical access to wounded personnel on both sides of the engagement. She had not been trained for this. She had done it because the situation had required it, and she was the person present, and she had the kind of steadiness, not calm exactly, but a thing that looked like calm from the outside, that was useful in rooms where the wrong tone of voice could cost someone something irreplaceable. The diplomatic corps had looked at those 3 instances and made her an offer. She had accepted it partly because the work was meaningful and partly because staying still had started to feel like a decision she was making in the wrong direction. That had been 14 years ago. She was good at the work now, the way she had been good at the medical work. Not because it came naturally, but because she found the internal logic of it and followed it wherever it led. The field medic kit was still in her personal effects. She had carried it since Kepler. She had never explained this to anyone who asked, because no one had asked in a way that suggested they actually wanted to know the answer, and she had developed a reliable instinct for the difference. The Vrathi arrived at the module precisely when they had said they would, which Soren had noted in the preliminary reports as characteristic. They had not, in any recorded instance of their communications with the advanced contact team, been early or late, not by minutes and not by seconds. The kind of precision that was either cultural or biological, and that the xenolinguists were still debating. There were 4 of them. The advanced briefings had names, or more accurately, the phonetic approximations of names that the translation matrix had developed over 6 months of preliminary contact, and Soren used them carefully, the way she used any tool whose properties she was still learning. Emissary Thavel led. This was clear not from any formal introduction, which did not occur in a Vrathi manner, but from the way the other 3 arranged themselves in relation to Thavel's movement, slightly behind, slightly outward, the geometry of deference that looked the same in every species Soren had encountered across 14 years of contact work. Thavel was tall. They were all tall. The Vrothy physiology had been described in the briefing materials with the careful neutrality that xenobiologists used when they were genuinely uncertain how to categorize something. Bipedal, bilaterally symmetric, with a skin surface that shifted subtly in response to stimuli. Not color exactly, but texture. The surface moving in patterns that the briefings authors believed were communicative and had not yet decoded. Their hands were long-fingered and they held them slightly forward from their bodies, a posture that Soren had noted in the footage, and that she had initially read as tension before revising this assessment. They held their hands that way because they were always ready to touch things. It was not tension. It was attention. They receive information through contact. The briefing said, objects retain what the Vrothy call resonance, the accumulated impression of how and by whom they were used. The Vrothy read this the way we read facial expressions, instinctively, continuously, and with a specificity we do not fully understand. Soren had arranged the module interior with this in mind. The conference table's surface was a composite material that had been fabricated 2 weeks before the mission and handled by a minimum number of people. The chairs were new. The document pads were new. The water vessels were new. The diplomatic gifts, a collection of human art objects, a sample of agricultural seed stock, a set of technical manuals for the translation matrix rendered in physical print, had all been produced within the month and handled in archival gloves. She had thought, carefully and for some time, about her field medic kit. She had decided to leave it in her personal quarters in the module's rear section. Then she had packed it in her carry case anyway, because she always packed it. It had been in the same carry case for 22 years, and the habit of its absence had never formed. And she had told herself this was a small thing. She was experienced enough to know that small things were rarely small things. She told herself it anyway. The first session lasted 3 hours. Soren had structured around what the briefing team called the inventory framework, a method developed from the preliminary contact reports in which both parties established shared reference points before moving to topics of substance. The idea was that you needed a common language before you could have a conversation in it, and that the common language was built from things both parties could agree were true: geography, biology, basic physics, the architecture of the universe that looked the same regardless of which part of it you were standing in. Thavel engaged with his framework with a quality of attention that Soren found herself calibrating to, not performing attention, giving it. There was a distinction, and it was legible in the body and in the rhythm of response, and Soren had spent 14 years learning to see it. Thavel listened to things and then answered them fully and did not speak while listening. This was rarer than it should have been, in Soren's experience, across any species. The other 3 contributed through Thavel, a relay system that was partly linguistic and partly something else. There were moments when Thavel answered a question that Soren had not yet finished framing, and the answer incorporated a nuance she had been about to raise. And she had looked at the other 3 and found their attention already moving to the next thing, as though they were processing slightly ahead of the spoken language. She did not remark on it. She filed it. The gifts were presented in the second hour, which was earlier than she had planned, but Thavel's expression, she had learned to read it in the footage, and was now learning to read it in person, had a quality of anticipation that she had decided to respond to rather than override. Diplomacy, at its best, was listening to a register that wasn't words. The Vrothy received each object with both hands, and held it for a long moment before setting it down. The agricultural seeds produced a sustained skin texture response across all 4 of them simultaneously. Thavel's answer when Soren described what the seeds grew into was long and detailed and moved, partway through, into a territory that the translation matrix rendered as gratitude, but that carried an undertone of something the matrix flagged as untranslated resonance. Soren noted this. The art objects produced less, not indifference. The texture shifts were present, but quieter. Soren suspected that the object's newness was part of this. Objects that had been handled by many people, used, worn, carried through the events of actual lives, would read differently than objects produced for an occasion. She had thought about this during the planning stages and had not had a good answer for it. The technical manuals were received with careful attention and set aside with what Soren read as polite acknowledgement. Information without the hands that had processed it was, she suspected, like a letter without a voice. The session ended with an exchange she had not anticipated. Thavel asked, and the question came with a deliberateness that told her it had been formulated before this meeting. Turned over and considered whether Soren had brought any personal objects. She kept her expression steady. It was a thing she was good at. Personal objects? Objects that belonged to your history, rather than this occasion. Thavel said, the objects prepared for exchange are clear and well chosen, but they tell us about what your civilization produces. We are interested in what it carries. Soren thought about the field medikit for a moment. I'll consider what might be appropriate to share, she said, and I'll bring it to the next session. She went back to her quarters afterward and looked at the kit for a long time. She had assembled it during the second month of the Kepler conflict, replacing the standard issue equipment with items she had sourced, modified, or in 3 cases fabricated herself from available materials, because the standard issue equipment had proven inadequate in ways she had not been willing to accept as fixed conditions. The suture kit was hers. She had repacked it 4,000 times in the field, her hands learning the contents by weight and position the way a musician's hands learned an instrument, so that she could find the right tool in darkness, in vibration, in the specific compressed focus of the situation where every second was a variable she was trying to control. The pressure bandages were replacements. She had used the originals, restocked, used the restocks, but the case itself was original. It had been in her hands at Kepler. It had been in the shuttle over the Kepler belt when an engagement that had ended the conflict had also ended the careers of everyone in her unit except her. It had been in her hands during the 76 minutes of that engagement, during which she had lost 6 people, had kept 3 others alive, and had spent the remaining time doing things that she had documented in the medical log and not in any other record. She had carried it for 22 years because putting it down had never felt like the right thing to do. She had not examined this feeling carefully because she had developed a reliable sense of which feelings could bear examination and which ones were better carried. She picked it up now and held it and thought about Thavel's question. Objects that belong to your history, rather than this occasion. She thought about what the kit contained, not the instruments, but what the instruments contained, what 22 years of hands had put into them, what the cases and the fabric and the metal had absorbed over 76 minutes above the Kepler belt while the ship shook and the oxygen recyclers ran below rated capacity, and she had made decisions in the specific, terrible clarity that came when the available choices had reduced to one. She thought about what a species that read objects the way the Vrothi read them would receive from those instruments. She was not the Captain Martin Riggs of this story. She was not going to bring the indomitable. She was not going to walk a delegation of sensitive beings into the most concentrated repository of a particular kind of human experience and call it an introduction. But she sat with the kit in her hands, and she thought about Thavel's question, and she thought about the things she had read in preliminary contact reports that the report writers had not said directly, and she thought about the 14 years she had spent in rooms where what you chose to offer told the other party more about you than anything you said. The objects prepared for exchange are clear and well chosen, but they tell us about what your civilization produces. We are interested in what it carries. She put the kit back in her carry case. She went to sleep, which took longer than usual, and in the morning she brought it to the session. She set it on the table between them, and said nothing for a moment. This is a field medical kit, she said. I've carried it for 22 years. I assembled it myself during a military engagement early in my career. I've used it to treat patients in field conditions, and I've never replaced a case. She paused. I want you to understand what I'm offering before you receive it. It comes from a specific period of my career that was not easy. What it carries, whatever you read from it, I cannot fully predict. She had learned this. 2. The best diplomacy was not the performance of confidence you didn't possess. It was accurate information offered without armor. Thavel looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention that she had been calibrating to for 2 days. Then Thavel's hands moved forward, and she set the kit on the table and let go. Thavel received it with both hands and held it. The skin texture shift was immediate and total. Not just Thavel, all 4 of the Vrothi, simultaneously, the same response moving through them the way a sound moved through a room, finding every surface. Soren stayed still and watched and said nothing. Thavel held the kit for 40 seconds, which she counted, and in those 40 seconds the texture of the room changed in a way that she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately and would never quite manage. The Vrothi were not static. They were never static. The constant subtle movement of their skin surface was as natural as breath, a form of ongoing expression that Soren had learned to watch without trying to interpret everything she saw. But what was happening now was different. The movement was deeper, slower. The way a person's face moved when they were not deciding how to look, but simply feeling something. And the feeling was too large to contain. The colleague on Thavel's right made a sound. Low, sustained, formless. Not distress. She was certain of this, the way she was certain of clinical things, through the accumulated pattern recognition of years. Something else. Something that wanted more word than she had for it. Then Thavel set the kit down, very carefully, and looked at Soren with an expression she had not seen from any of them in 2 days of close observation. What happened to the people you used this for? Thavel asked. The question landed differently than she had expected, not as an intrusion, as the thing a person asked when they already knew the answer and needed to hear confirmed aloud. Some of them lived, Soren said. Some of them didn't. You knew, when you were using these instruments, that both outcomes were possible. Yes, and you continued. It was not a question, but Soren answered it anyway. That was the work. Thavel's hands were still on the table, close to the kit, but not touching it now. The texture of Thavel's skin was doing something Soren had no reference point for. We do not lose people, Thavel said slowly. Our medical knowledge has been sufficient for many generations. Disease is managed. Injury is repaired. The instruments of healing in our history are used with the certainty of success. A pause that felt structural. I have understood this as a condition of our civilization. I had not understood it as an absence. Soren looked at her. This object, Thavel said, contains something we have no word for. The effort of trying to do an impossible thing, repeated across many years, with no guarantee and no certainty, and continuing anyway, not from ignorance of the odds. Thavel's voice was careful, not stripped back, the way Lyra's had been above the Indomitable's plasma breach, overwhelmed by fidelity, careful in the way of someone speaking across a distance they have just understood was larger than they thought. From the decision to try in full knowledge of them, the room was quiet. We have a word, Thavel said after a moment, for the resonance left by objects used in moments of complete certainty. Objects whose users knew the outcome and acted accordingly. A pause. We do not have a word for this. For objects used across years of uncertainty, toward outcomes that were not guaranteed, by someone who chose to keep going. Thavel looked at Soren. The object is saturated with it. Every instrument. The case itself. A pause. And you have carried it for 22 years. Yes, not as a memorial. No, Soren said. Not as a memorial. Thavel waited. I carry it because putting it down never felt right. She said, I've thought about why. I think it's because it's not finished yet. The work, whatever form it takes now. The silence that followed was not the silence of misunderstanding. It was a silence of something being absorbed. The Vrothi asked a recess for 6 hours, which the preliminary contact protocols had identified as a normal interval and which Soren used to write the preliminary session report, to eat a meal she did not taste, and sit in her quarters with the field medic kit on the table in front of her and wait for whatever came next. What came next arrived in the form of Thavel, alone, which was not the protocol, and which told her before a word was spoken that the next hour was going to be different from the previous ones. Thavel sat across from her in the small room and was quiet for a moment in a way that Soren recognized. The way a person was quiet when they had arranged what they wanted to say and were making sure the arrangement was honest. I need to tell you something, Thavel said, that our diplomatic briefings did not prepare me to tell you. All right, when we received your advance contact, we assessed your civilization according to our established contact framework. The assessment was favorable. Your technological development, your social organization, your communication structures, all of these place you in a category we have encountered before. A young spacefaring civilization, broadly cooperative, with a particular kind of ambition that tends toward expansion rather than consolidation. A pause. We were not wrong about these things, but we were incomplete. Soren waited. What we read from your object today, Thavel said, is something our contact framework has no category for. A pause that felt like the space before diagnosis. In the civilizations we have encountered that have developed space travel, there are two patterns. The first is civilizations that have solved suffering, who have reached the stars after eliminating most of the conditions that produce extreme human pain. Their objects are clean. Their resonance is the resonance of curiosity and order. A pause. The second is civilizations that have not solved suffering, but have not survived contact with each other long enough to develop the particular thing your object carries. What particular thing? Soren asked. The capacity to work in direct relationship with loss, Thavel said. To pick up an instrument in full knowledge of what you might not be able to do with it, and use it anyway, year after year, as a practice, not as a crisis, as a choice, renewed continuously. Thavel's hands were forward on the table. We have read many objects from many civilizations. We have never read an object like yours. The room held the weight of this for a moment. Is that a problem? Soren asked. No, Thavel said. It is a finding. A pause. Asterisk, you are not what we expected. What we expected, we have met before. What you are, asterisk, Thavel stopped. Then, we need more time to understand what to do with what you are. The formal request arrived through diplomatic channels the following morning, properly formatted and precisely worded in the Vrothy manner. Context, reasoning, conclusion. Context. The contact sessions have produced information of cultural significance beyond initial assessment parameters. Reasoning. The Vrothy contact framework required supplementary consultation with their broader scholarly community before proceeding to formal treaty negotiation. Conclusion. They requested a recess of 30 days. Contact would resume. The channel was not closed. Soren read it 3 times. Then she wrote her own report. It took her 2 hours, which was not unusual for her. She had developed, over 14 years of diplomatic work, the habit of writing toward what was true rather than what was useful, and then editing toward what was both. This one was difficult in a specific way, because the difficult thing was not what had happened. It was what it might mean in the long term, that the first thing a civilization of empathic object readers had found in humanity that they had no category for was not the capacity for violence, not the scale of human ambition, not the complexity of human political structures, or the reach of human technology. It was a field medic kit of a retired combat surgeon who had never put it down. In retrospect, she wrote, the choice of object was not strategic. I did not select it for diplomatic effect. I carried it because I have always carried it, which is itself, I now understand, the thing the Vrothy read. Not the objects used during individual moments of crisis, but the object carried continuously, through all the time in between, by someone who made no particular ceremony of it. The resonance they described is not the residue of extremity. It is a residue of persistence without an audience. She looked at that phrase for a long time. If the indomitable represents what humanity becomes when it fights, she wrote, this may represent something different. The record of what humanity does with the years in between. The quiet, continuous choice to keep the instruments ready and the work ongoing. Not because the outcome is certain, but because the alternative has never felt like a real option. She filed a report. Then she picked up the field medic kit, held it for a moment in both hands, and put it back in the carry case, where it had always been. The Vrothy broadcast reached 12 civilizations over the following month. Soren learned this from Admiral Haverstock, who called on a secure channel with the expression of a man who was managing something large and wanted her assessment before he decided how to hold it. The broadcast, Haverstock said, described humanity as a civilization of profound practical persistence. It described a specific human capacity to continue working toward outcomes that were not guaranteed across extended time, while maintaining the instruments and the intention simultaneously. It noted that this capacity appeared to saturate human objects in a manner detectable to empathic species across great distances and multiple generations. It also noted carefully that this was not what they had expected. The civilization that received it, Haverstock said, are divided in their response. A pause. Asterisk, the ones with empathic faculties are asking for contact, several that we've been trying to reach for decades. They want to understand the objects. They want to, asterisk, he paused again, choosing words. They want to know how a species develops that particular kind of resonance. And the others? Soren asked. The non-empathic ones. The the ones who would read the Vrothy broadcast and ask about its cause. Quieter than they were, Haverstock said, which is not the same as silent and not the same as safe, but quieter. He looked at her through the screen for a moment. "You brought a field kit," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a thing a person said when they were still locating the shape of something. "I always bring it. I know." A pause. "I read your file before this deployment. I know what it is." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't tell you this before you left because I didn't want you to think about it strategically. Would it have changed anything?" "Probably not," he said, "which is, I think, the point." Soren walked the exterior perimeter of the module that evening, alone, while the second continent sun descended into a horizon that was the wrong color and the right shape. The Vrothy continent was quiet in the way of places that had never had human noise in them. Not empty, alive, thick with the biological activity of an ecosystem that had not calibrated itself around anything humanity had built. The sounds were unfamiliar. The air was slightly thick. The emergency environmental suit she wore over her uniform reminded her, faintly, of field gear, which was its own kind of resonance. She thought about the broadcast. 12 civilizations. The ones who wanted to understand the objects and the ones who had gone quieter. She thought about Thavel's phrase, the capacity to work in direct relationship with loss. The objects used across years of uncertainty. The case itself. She had not chosen to bring the kit as a message. She had brought it because she always brought it, which was itself, apparently, the message. She thought about this for a while, about the 22 years of carrying it, about the people she had lost with it in her hands, and the people she had kept, and the 76 minutes above the Kepler belt, and the years of field work and diplomatic sessions, and the drawer where she kept her decorations without looking at them. She had not been trying to say anything with the kit. She had been carrying the thing she carried, because you didn't put down the work. You didn't put it down because somewhere at the center of the decision to keep going was something that she had never named precisely, but it felt continuously, a kind of fidelity to the people she hadn't been able to keep, to the one she had, to the possibility that the next case might come out differently than the last one. She had not known this was unusual. She had not known that it left a mark. She had not known that what a person carried for 22 years out of habit and grief and refusal became, in the hands of species that could read objects, the clearest thing she had ever said about herself. She looked out at the Vrothy horizon and thought about the 12 civilizations reading a broadcast about a field kit she had never put down. Then she walked back inside and checked her carry case, because the habit of it was the whole of the thing, and she went to sleep. The Vrothy had no word for what the kit carried. They had said so clearly in the report that Soren eventually submitted as the formal record of first contact. She noted this in the final section, under the heading Cultural Observations of Reciprocal Significance. The Vrothy had developed, over their contact history, a taxonomy of civilizational resonance, the emotional and behavioral patterns that saturate the objects of a species across generations and can be read by empathic faculties as a form of cultural record. In the course of this contact, they encountered a pattern for which their taxonomy had no existing term. They had proposed a new one. The translation is approximate, as first translations always are, but the closest rendering in standard is the mark left by someone who picked up the work knowing it was not finished and did not put it down. The Vrothy had proposed that this be recorded in their contact archive as a defining characteristic of human civilization. I have not objected. I would note, for the record, that this was not a strategy. It was not a diplomatic choice. It was a field medikit that I have carried for 22 years because I have never found a good reason to stop. I do not know if that distinction matters. I suspect it is the only thing that does. The field medikit is currently in Soren's carry case. It will be there tomorrow. This is not a small thing.